moving on to Serie A, Juve, that we've talked about several times on OTC over the last few months as, you know, potential dark horses for the title in Italy. Their European form leaves a lot to be desired. After losing 1-0 to Stuttgart, do you mind just giving us your opinion of where Juve are at? They don't seem to be able to score a goal for the love of money or anything else.
I don't know if we can say their European form hasn't been that strong. The first two games of the Champions League, they won and scored 3 goals in both of them. But they were certainly poor against Stuttgart. They were easily their worst performance of the season, domestically or European, against Stuttgart. The loss didn't come until the very, very end. Some absolutely heroic work from Mattia Peroni in goal, and it took a really, really nice goal from Albi Lautore to finally break them. But yeah, there's certainly questions with this Juventus team. I think domestically, the feeling has been this team never concedes a goal. They've only conceded once in Serie A all season. But there are questions up front, and I think that this is the first time in the European games we've seen those same questions about the lack of attacking. I think there's a lack of attacking identity, and certainly a lack of attacking connectivity in this team that really was felt against Stuttgart. And it's not a new thread to say that Dusan Vlahovic looked isolated. I think that was a very constant thread through much of Max Allegri's time in charge. But definitely in this game, it felt like Vlahovic was on his own a lot.
So you wouldn't describe it as a crisis point, this defeat to Stuttgart?
I've seen people reacting as if this is almost a crisis for Juventus because, they haven't been scoring goals as much as people want them to. There's been a lot of 0-0 draws in Serie A. They only got past Lazio at the weekend, really, because Lazio had a player sent off. I think that game would have looked very, very different if it wasn't for Romagnoli leaving that game in the first half. And even after Romagnoli goes off, it takes Juventus most of the remaining 90 minutes to get whatever it was with him off the pitch. I think it was about 65 minutes with him off the pitch to get the ball into the net, and it requires an own goal to do it. There's a lot of struggle in that game to carve out attacking opportunities. So people are looking at it and going, hang on, this is Thiago Motta. We've heard all about his Bologna team that was so intrepid and so courageous in the way that it played and did such interesting attacking things, with Joshua Zirkzee dropping and Lewis Ferguson pushing through with Orsolini and Calafiori, of course, who was built his reputation as this great distributing defender who would stray halfway up the pitch. All those things that we talked about with Thiago Motta, people aren't seeing yet from Juventus, and so there's a frustration about it. But I really struggle with this idea that it is being presented almost as, this is some crisis point because they had a bad game against Stuttgart when they're third in Serie A right now. They've won their first 2 Champions League games. It feels a bit like a crisis. What crisis to me? That this is a team that is clearly still in evolution in the post-Max Allegri era. And yes, it is not the constant free-flowing and optimistic football we were hoping for, and perhaps we first thought we were seeing at the beginning of this season, that we're leading people, even on this podcast, talk about them as one of the most exciting teams in Europe. Which I was subscribed to, by the way, so I'm definitely not knocking anyone who did think that. It doesn't feel like a crisis for me, and I think it's worth saying as well against Stuttgart, they were missing a lot of players who have made them good this season. I think Cambiaso, even when he came on in the second half, you saw the team immediately looked more connected than it had in the first half. There were some players in the team, the right-back Savona, who's a 21-year-old who has been playing a lot and who I think really was one of the weakest points of that team with Mittelstadt, and levelling, exposing him a little bit. I think that there's a lot in this story about this one game that suggests to me that it's not a crisis point. It's a bad game for a team that's still working out its identity under a new manager.
You might remember, Andy, that David Cartledge, when we were talking about Juventus in September, he was talking about them as, for him, the most interesting team in Europe. And high praise, in my view, that high praise can be easily outdone by just the kind of loss to Stuttgart that perhaps they shouldn't have lost.
Look, I still wouldn't argue with David, actually. I think they are really exciting to watch, but I think like part of that excitement is not knowing what's going to come next, and the fact that they are a work in progress, and the fact that Thiago Motta, despite the fact that he's been fated to be a superstar coach from a really early point, and remember PSG were very close to appointing him before they got Luis Enrique, he's developing too. You know, this is his first go at the Champions League as a coach, and as Nicky says, they're forming the Champions League globally. I mean, those two opening wins against PSV, they were exceptional, and they were exceptionally brave against Leipzig, even though it wasn't quite the same level of performance from beginning to end. But you know, that PSV one, that could have been anything, that score in the first hour, really. What I guess is, I'm trying to work out, Nicky, if it's like a growing pain or something that could become a bigger problem for them going throughout the season, really. The fact that you look at the teams that have come to Turin so far this season, and Roma, yeah, okay, they've got their problems, but you know, they've got some good players. I don't think it's unreasonable to say. You look at Napoli, you look at Lazio at the weekend, who after Romagnoli was sent off after like 25 minutes, Lazio played the rest of the game with 10 men. And now this. I mean, I think this game against Stuttgart's a little bit differently because it was just a poor performance. And Stuttgart, we have to say, were exceptional at the Bernabeu, and they could have won there. They could easily be looking at 9 points so far, and they're not. You know, they're a good team, and also they're a team with guts. That they are not one of these second tier teams who just want to get behind the ball. They want to take possession and they want to try and dominate. That is Sebastian Hoeneß's credo. But I just wonder if this is something that's like a statistical anomaly that, as it picks up momentum, starts to live in the head of younger players a little bit. I thought it's quite noticeable against Lazio, actually, how Dusan Vlahovic, who obviously another player who, going back to the last section, could have been sold at various points over the last little while, how he, having received a little bit of criticism that I feel was a bit unfair at the start of the season, he's taken it upon himself to almost be a leader. And when they were struggling to make that breakthrough against Lazio, it was him geeing up his fellow players. It was him comforting them if they missed a chance. It was him saying to the crowd, like, come on, get behind us. And I guess that is the thing, because you look at, say, Kenan Yildiz, because of his technical excellence, he sort of recommends himself as the leader, the technical leader of that attack. But it's a lot of pressure to place on him, isn't it? And I guess there's a lot of pressure on him to create all the time. So, you know, do they need to find that alternative? Do they need to find that back up to Vlahovic, or is it something else?
I think the pressure on Vlahovic right now is enormous, and when you look at the fact that domestically he's the only player who scored more than one goal for Juventus, in the Champions League he's the only player who scored more than one goal for Juventus, there is absolutely this pressure on him to score the goals. And I think that the leadership role that he has in that attack that has a lot of young players involved in it as well is something significant. And you know, one of the interesting pieces of the fallout to this game, I think, is how Thiago Motta reacted to it, which was to immediately put it all on himself, say, listen, this is my decisions. The players were given a day off after the game, which goes so against the traditional Italian mentality of, right, we've lost a big game, inter ritiro, inter training camp. He was like, right, now you all go take a game off and acknowledge he made mistakes. I think Motta absolutely deserves a big chunk of the blame. And one of the things that, to bring this back to Vlahovic, one of the things that I think he did wrong was, at the point in the game where having not been good for the first hour of this game, and really been lucky still to be at 0-0, when he did make the changes in the middle of the team, bringing on Locatelli, who again has been starting most games this season and was missing from that midfield, I think, badly. Cambiaso, bringing him on the right of defence, but going forward as well. I think that the team actually immediately started to have a better hold on the ball, immediately started to do better things with possession. And then almost as soon as he does that, he takes off Vlahovic, who's been starved of service for the whole game. And I think that's one of the mistakes that Motta made in this game, was was taking off his one viable striker at that point when actually Juventus did finally start to play their game a bit. But equally, with Milik injured, Vlahovic can't play every minute of every game, and they've got the Derby d'Italia against Inter coming up at the weekend, and that onus on Vlahovic that Andy's alluded to is definitely real, because with Milik out, there isn't someone else who's picking up that burden of being the number 9.
Andy, what Fabio Capello, the former England manager, of course, said following Juventus's loss was against Stuttgart. He said that Italian football has a problem with intensity, as Serie A sides tend to struggle when they meet foreign clubs that run and press. Is there anything in that?
I don't know. I do think a lot of generalisations have been made about. I know he's talking in a wider context, but about Juventus since the start of the season, and this goes back to like before the Leipzig game, which could have been a season definer, I think, because of like the huge morale lift you get from it. That they came back from this improbable situation and showed not just their bravery, as I was saying before, but their ingenuity, their attacking quality. But I think it's a mistake to try and define a season, especially a season of a team that's growing, by one particular game or one particular moment. Now, look, maybe he's not doing that. Maybe he's had this thought for a while. And I think maybe it's got slight reference to Milan's opening game against Liverpool, in which Milan weren't really at it. Though I think you have to bear in mind that A, that's Liverpool, and they're amazing. They're one of the very best teams in Europe. And B, Milan are, again, still sort of pulling themselves together, really, and in this sort of, and certainly at that point, we're in this sort of like transitional phase, really. But look, I think the intensity of Italian football and the pace of Italian football is much higher than it ever was. So I think, as I said, going back to singling out Juventus for these little understandable hiccups, and you had like Di Canio talking about it on TV going back a month ago, saying, "Oh well, what's the difference from when Allegri's in charge, because they're still not scoring goals. When they were struggling to score." And it's like, well, you can actually watch the games. If you're just going to read the results and sort of make a judgment off that, then fine. But I think there does have to be an understanding of that. And really, apart from Inter, who what you're going to get with, I think you could argue that a lot of the big Italian teams are in some state of flux at the moment. So I think when you look at, Inter getting to the Champions League final the year before last, with, we have to say, a weaker team than they've got at the moment, with Milan getting to the semi-final, I think we can almost forget that like these teams are working stuff out. And really, if there are any teams that are going to be benefited, apart from financially, by the 8-game group stage, is probably them. I mean, it feels like this morning there's a lot of jumping to conclusions about where teams are. And, you think of, like, say, Bayern and Atletico, they've lost 2 out of 3. Are they in big trouble? Well, if they'd have lost the first 2 of, or won 1, or drawn 1 and lost 1 of the first 2 in a 6-game group stage, like, no one would be batting an eyelid, really. And it's that sense of, we don't really know where we are, because we don't know what a reasonable point total is. But taking it back strictly to Italian teams, I think if we're looking specifically at Juventus, I think it's really easy to jump to conclusions on the back of 1 or 2 results, particularly a performance like this. But also, I think it's one of the big challenges, Nicky, that Thiago Motta has. The fact that he wants to start something completely new, and he's got a sporting director that's going to help him do that in Giuntoli as well. But even if intellectually that you've got to start again and build again, it's still Juventus. So there's this pressure that's completely not consistent with the actual situation.
Yeah, I think what you said about Di Canio really hits, because actually watching the games, yes, it's a completely valid criticism of Juventus against Stuttgart. They were far too passive at the beginning and they got overrun. But I do feel like listening to Fabio Capello. I've been covering Italian football professionally now. I think this is my 18th year, and I feel like I could have heard that sentence at any point in the last 18 years and would have been like, yeah, that's a sentence that people say. And there's a grain of truth in it. I'm not saying there's no truth in it at all, but are we acting as if there aren't 5 Italian teams in this Champions League specifically because they did well in Europe last season? This idea that they can't hack it in these competitions is disprovable by literally what happened last season, by the fact these teams are here. Atalanta, who play one of the best pressing games in Europe, winning the Europa League last season. To generalise like that, I find a bit exhausting. And the other thought I wanted to say on Motta, just because I didn't say it before, it took him a full season really to get the best out of Bologna, to take them to that level he took them to. There were good signs in the first season, but it was the second season that really came on. Bear in mind that he's taken over a team that, unlike Bologna, is playing every 3 days. Bologna had a week every round to prepare things. He's got all these young players, just talking about Savona playing a lot of games, but obviously Yildiz has been the one that we're all excited and hoping to see more from, and hasn't really quite blossomed despite one brilliant goal against PSV as yet. He hasn't got time to stop and keep reworking and retooling. It's constantly doing things on the fly. I think a little bit of patience is fair in this scenario for this team, and I'm not trying to defend them completely because I thought they were dreadful against Stuttgart, but I think this generalising is a bit excessive.